All right, Key Surette, welcome to the Stones of Strength podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. It's an honor.
Yeah, I've really been looking forward to this one, Keith, because I've had a lot of back and forth with a lot of stone lifters in my few years doing this, but there's nobody that I've talked to more about stones or strength than you. Like, we just have hours and hours, probably into the days now, of voice messages going back and forth. And we have a constant, rapport going back and forth and discussions about it. So I'm really happy that you decided to come on with us and share your knowledge and your experience with all of our listeners.
Yes, again, thank you for having me. It's a fantastic honor, and I am extremely happy to be here.
Awesome.
Right on.
And it's kind of a cool situation because David, you have so much history, and like David said, you guys have spent so much time chatting back and forth about stones and strength. But as far as having a digital footprint to your stone lifting accolades, you keep things quite private, right? You've got about 6 videos. Each of them it's almost like a mini documentary of some of your lifts and your travels. So for me, you're a bit of an unknown entity, as with a lot of the listeners. This is a really cool opportunity that we kind of get to pull the curtain back and learn about some of your adventures and some of your knowledge on strength building. So.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I am private, and but with that said, I am happy to share everything. But yeah, I've always been a little bit torn with social media, and I think that just like any other tool, it depends on how you use it. And I want to make more of a connection with fellow stone lifters, so that's really why I'm here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, this should hopefully help, and I'm excited for everyone to hear what you have to say, man. So obviously, I know quite a bit about you from all of our back and forth, but Dale doesn't know too much about you, and a lot of people might not. So can you maybe just, like you said, pull the blind back on your history of strength, your history of sport, and how you came to be such a successful and prominent stone lifter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've made myself a list just so I don't forget anything. Just to make sure that everything is factually correct. And it's been a fantastic opportunity for me to take a trip down memory lane and to really think about why I do this and what I've done. And it's been fantastic. So I got started. I first lifted weights just by the suggestion of a friend. I had a friend, I worked with a guy, and he lifted weights, and he said, "Hey man, you should come lift some weights with me." And so we did. We started training that way. It's funny because I still remember the first pump that I ever got. I did a bench press in my basement, and just with some rinky dink weights. And it was such a bizarre feeling. I didn't know, I had never had a pump in my muscles in my entire life. And it was so bizarre and unusual. And we very quickly outgrew the basement. And so we decided to join a local gym. So I trained, I first joined a gym. It's still open to this day. It's called Defining Bodies. And I joined the gym, and it was a fantastic experience. And I went out and bought Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, and I read the entire thing cover to cover. The thing's like 800 pages, and I had no idea what I was doing. I still remember what it was like to walk into the gym and feel stupid, for lack of a better term. I had no idea what I was doing, and I looked around and I thought that everybody did know what they were doing, and this was even after reading Arnold's book. And so I also remember my very first experience getting stronger, which even in those early days, it was a sign of, what my preference was. And so I was doing a set of stiff-legged deadlifts, and I think I was using like 100 pounds, and I had done 10 reps the week before. And I was following a program from Arnold's book, and I did a set of like 20 reps with that same weight the following week. And I thought, this is amazing. And, so the weights are the same, and the movement is the same. So it must be that, must be me that has changed. And it was just an incredible thing. And I remember even then, And this was very early days, first couple of months of training for sure. And I just thought, this is something. And so I was turned on to the strength side of it really from then. And so I continued to train, like a bodybuilder, I guess you would say, following one of Arnold's splits. But I was very, very fortunate to meet a guy named Chris Frost. He was my first real training partner. And he was in university. He was taking kinesiology. He had a personal training certificate. He was a natural bodybuilder, phenomenal shape, very muscular, very aesthetic, and very strong. And he ate perfectly. He just did everything perfectly. And so he was just a perfect mentor. And I really got lucky because that was, again, very early days. And it just set me on the right road. And so from there, I ended up going to our local YMCA. So I switched gyms, and at the YMCA, I trained there. I started getting into more powerlifting, and I've never competed in powerlifting ever before, but I trained just like a powerlifter would, or at least in those days. And what's funny is I ended up packing on slabs of muscle more so than when I had been training like a bodybuilder. It was pretty funny. Yeah. And so I trained that way for a little while, and I was at the YMCA one day, and I was already a huge fan of strongman. I owned all of the DVDs of the World's Strongest Man finals. The complete set. I had bought them off of eBay. It was the only place that you could buy them at the time. Yeah. And I saw a guy at the gym, and he had a strongman t-shirt on. And I started talking to him. I had no idea who the guy was. And I started talking to him, and I asked him about his shirt, and I asked him if he competed in strongman, and he did. And I talked shop with him, and it was absolutely fantastic. And so the guy's name's Jay Smith. I don't think he competes in strongman anymore, but he was a fantastic strongman. And we became very fast friends. He brought a log into the gym. That was my first experience with a strongman implement, and I was hooked. The pressing a log was unlike anything I had ever done. And he invited me out to his grandparents' house. That's who he lived with. And he said, we can train events, once the weather warms up and it's nice outside. And so I went outside, and I went out to his place and trained outside. And even that was cool because I had never trained outside before. And so that's where I did my first ever stone. He had a 225 Atlas stone, and I did lift it, but it was incredibly hard. It was max effort. I couldn't have done another 5 pounds, I don't think. No tacky at that time. And it was, again, I was hooked. And so there's a couple things that I vividly remember from those early strongman training sessions. I would be so exhausted that when I would go home, I would have to have a nap. And I was just a young guy at the time. I'm 44 now. And it was bizarre to me how I could, let's say deadlift 500 pounds in the gym, but walk a yoke 10 feet and have to have a nap afterwards. It was hilarious. And so it was great. It was great. So from there, I started competing in strongman just locally, and I competed in strongman for 10 years. And eventually I opened up my own gym. It's called Jones Gym. And really it was a way for me to be able to have a place to train myself and share my love and my passion of lifting weights and strongman and everything, related to it. So I would say that would be my start. As far as sports, I did play a lot of sports and games growing up. Baseball was my first love, for sure. I played Little League baseball. I played until I was about 10 years old. I played hockey for a couple of years. I played basketball from the time I was about 12 until 14. I then got into playing pool. I played pool from the time I was about 15 until 30, so a very long time. And also
You're
during that
quite
time,
accomplished in that too.
what's that?
Don't skip out on your accomplishments with that. You're very good at pool.
Yeah, I was. I won 2 national championships as a junior, and I went to the World Championships twice. And I finished. They only invited 16 to the World Championships each year, so I was automatically in the top 16 each time. I played pool for a very long time. I absolutely loved it. It taught me a lot of life skills, a lot of things, and it also gave me the opportunity to travel a lot early in my life, and that I think that's really important. So I was very, very, very lucky to have had those opportunities that early on. That really did, I think, really. I think it gave direction in my life from an early age that was incredibly valuable. And in retrospect, I think one of the most important things that's ever happened to me for sure. I at that same time, I took up golf. I played golf from the time I was 19 until the time I was about 30, which is when I got into strongman. But I really only stopped playing golf because I opened the gym. And there's only so much time, of course, and there's only so much you can do. And I absolutely loved golf and really miss it, especially miss the guys, the social part. And I then competed in strongman for 10 years. And so from when I was 30 to 40, basically, and I lifted historical stones for the first time when I was 38. So that would be my story.
It's interesting hearing sort of your origins with respect to strength training and building strength, but also then the other athletic endeavors that you were also doing, and how they all sort of seem to, like, you sort of went down the road from form with bodybuilding training down to function with strongman and stone lifting. And I feel like the strongman and the stone lifting is maybe a bit of an intersection between that strength-based training, but also what seems to be, the analytical side of your mind that probably lent itself very well to golf and pool, intersecting at strongman, where you're pairing up the strength portion, which you're interested in, plus the sort of need to be solving puzzles and figuring out the implements in addition to being able to, strong enough to lift them. There's that sort of tactical aspect that probably, I'm guessing, sort of piqued your interest as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree completely. I think that it's very interesting. It was also just a different time too. I think that it's kind of lost on this new generation that there was a time when people really only lifted weights to look better. And that wasn't that long ago. And there especially wasn't a whole lot of information on powerlifting, and certainly not strongman. Like I said, I needed to buy the DVDs off of eBay. They weren't even the legitimate, DVDs. Some guy had burned them off of something, I don't even know. So, but yes, I agree. And even powerlifting. So even though I trained like a powerlifter and very much enjoyed that, powerlifting is definitely limited in there's only 3 lifts. And that's not to take anything away from powerlifting at all, because I think it's fantastic. Similar to Olympic weightlifting, where there's only 2 lifts. Now, I think that strongman and CrossFit would be much more similar to each other, although strongman wouldn't like to hear that. But there's even another dynamic to CrossFit where you need to be extremely conditioned. So, of course, they're not lifting as heavy weights, but there's even more events to practice and to master. So one of the big appeals with strongman certainly was the challenge of figuring out that puzzle, for sure. How to program for it, how to not overtrain. Again, I was taking naps after my first 10 training sessions. It's exhausting. There's just not many things that you can do in a day that would be as exhausting as an events day in strongman. And
That's for sure.
Yeah. And so then I think that carries over certainly to, and to go with pool or golf, which are certainly far less physical and very technical. I agree. I think that helps with stone lifting tremendously in, again, programming, and being meticulous, and being as technically efficient as possible, um, to be able to get the absolute most out of your body. I mean, that's really the goal in anything that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And just for everyone listening, like Keith didn't just compete in strongman. You competed on a world stage a number of times. You're being very humble. You were very high level.
Yeah, so I competed. I made it to the World Championships 4 times. 2014 in Finland, and then the official Strongman Games 3 years in a row. A lot of people know them as OSG. 2017, they were in Raleigh, North Carolina. 2018, same location, and then 2019 in Daytona Beach. But I will say this, that I was good enough to get there, but that was it. Those guys were absolutely at a different level, and I was not at that level. And I feel as though it was a fantastic accomplishment just to get there. Fantastic experiences, and I really feel like, almost as if I am the most overachieving strongman maybe in the 90 kilogram class. And also I do think worth mentioning that I am lifetime drug free. And
I think
I have no idea. I have no idea, who's taking drugs there and who's not. But there are certainly some guys that are on drugs. And that obviously makes a difference. Yeah. So I feel like I got, really the most out of my body that I possibly could. And the 2019 competition was my very last competition. I knew going into it that it was going to be my last. And I wanted to walk away on my own terms, which I did. And I was happy with what I did. And I've settled in nicely to stone lifting. It's been a fantastic transition.
Talk about a hybrid athlete. I would challenge everyone listening to this to find someone else who has competed on a world level strongman as well as pool and golf. So
no doubt,
you might be up there with not many others. So
yeah, it is quite funny actually, because pool is so different than strongman. It's quite funny actually, but it seems like almost a lifetime ago to me, and I was certainly a different person then. I was much younger, and I didn't lift weights at that time when I first started playing pool. And I very rarely play now, but even when, like, I'm talking about maybe once a year, and even when I go play now, I can still play very, very well. It's I definitely think I was more of a natural in pool than any of the other things that I've done. I think that and that's what I mean when I say that I feel like I'm an overachieving strongman and even stone lifter, because I don't think that I necessarily have great genetics for this. Dave and I have talked about this a lot, even just recently. I definitely think that I have good genetics for resiliency and not getting injured. And those are really important. But I think as far as the other stuff goes, I just feel like I really got everything out of my body that I possibly could have, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, you should be.
Absolutely.
And it's so you and I have got to know each other quite well over somewhere around the past year, and just maybe 2 weeks ago you had mentioned your pool background, and when you had said that, it actually didn't surprise me at all. Learning, like knowing what I know about you with your mind, because you are a very analytical man. And so when you said pool, I went, of course he was, because it just made so much sense to me.
Yeah, again, that game, it came very natural to me. And now I did play hours and hours and hours a day, which you need to do in anything to develop. But I was definitely given better cards in that particular game, I think.
Awesome. Well, why don't we jump into now stone lifting? Natural stone lifting, historic stone lifting. Tell us about that, how you went from strongman to being like you. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, you just finished your 4th stone lifting tour and your 50th historical stone.
Yes, that's right. Yep. So
unreal.
Successful lifts.
Yeah, you haven't missed a single lift yet.
Yeah, I hope you didn't just jinx me.
No, no
So
way,
I
man.
think
That's amazing.
Knocking on wood.
that's the thing with historical stones. There are many variables, many factors. You're not sleeping in your own bed. You're not sleeping in your own bed. You're not eating your own food. You are sometimes driving on the wrong side of the road. Um,
Sure.
I one time had traveler's diarrhea, and that was absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
I do not recommend that.
Yeah.
No.
So there are those factors, and then there's the weather. If you're going to go to Scotland, it's going to be wet. It's inevitable. The stones are going to
Yeah.
be wet, and they're going to be more difficult.
Yeah.
There's jet lag. This trip from
Mm.
Sweden coming back is the worst I've ever experienced. It took me 5 days to recover. So yeah, it's I think absolutely some luck involved, because again, you can't attempt a stone 10 times. There are other stones that you're going to, and absolutely I think skill in reading the stones, and I what I personally like to do is, of course, have a look at the stone first, but I like to put my hands on the stone as quick as possible, because one of the things that I've learned is oftentimes the stone looks like it will lift easier in a certain way, but once you put your hands on it, it just does not feel that way. And I think that certainly how the stone feels is much more important than how the stone looks.
Yeah.
And even finding handles, it's very, very interesting. Um, it's the same is true for finding handles of a stone. I think there are times when, if it's a difficult stone to read, I will put my hands on that stone and I will, work my way around that stone in every conceivable way. And and sometimes you have to abandon a handle or a grip that you think is superior because it's not. You get feedback on your first attempt, let's say. Um,
Mhm.
so anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track there, but to answer your
Oh,
question, I got into stone lifting through a friend of mine, Terry McKay, and he went to Scotland, and he was fortunate enough to be toured around by Peter Martin himself.
so cool.
And
Amazing.
yeah, so I knew Terry McKay from competing in strongman with him and against him. Um, and he was a farmer and a super strong guy, fantastic at stones. And he had a family tie to the Strathmore of Durness. And so,
Wow.
yeah, so it's very cool. So he had correspondence with Peter Martin, and Peter could not go to that particular stone with him, but was going to travel to the other stones with him. So Terry was going to the Strathmore of Durness himself. And Peter told him, if you lift this stone, you would probably be the first McKay to lift it in 200 years. So absolutely no pressure.
No
Would,
kidding.
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah. And so, of course, Terry did lift the stone and met up with Peter the next day, and they toured around and lifted, I think, 7 or 8 more stones after that. So he came back, and I had my own gym at that time. I was already opened, and we talked about the stones, and he said how it was a life-changing experience for him. He highly recommended that I go, and I I I talk with Terry often, and so we talked about it numerous times. And then Rogue's documentary Stoneland came out, and I watched it, and I remember I was laying in my lazy boy, and after that finished, I committed to going to Scotland right then and there. And I had a question, can I lift those stones? And there's only one way to get an answer. And so I actually called Terry on the phone from my lazy boy, and he said that he would contact Martin Jancics, and he did. And I spoke to Martin, in just a couple of days, and Martin agreed to tour me around Scotland. And so, yeah, so I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. Here's the guy that's, one of the guys that's in the documentary himself. And the next thing you know, I'm meeting with him in Scotland. So I went in October of 2017. That was my first trip to Scotland.
Not to take us on too much of a tangent, maybe just touch on this real quickly because you had said at the beginning of the episode that part of what you want to do is get a little more familiar with some of the other members of the stone lifting community. But even just that experience right there with Martin sort of defines what the stone lifting community is like. They're just a lot of amazing people, amazingly strong people that are willing to help, willing to share their time and share their knowledge. The fact that you kind of went straight to someone who had just been featured in a prominent documentary and he was willing to carve out time to take you on a stone tour just shows that there's just, it's passion, it's camaraderie, it's connection, like all of those things are what makes this community, I don't want to say different than other strength communities, but at least in my experience, such a cool group of people to be involved in. So
yes, I couldn't agree more. Martin took time off. He took his weekend off from work to tour me around. So those were his only days off. That's time away from his family, which is not lost on me. And and we make a connection in that one trip that will last a lifetime.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So speaking of Scotland and stone lifting, that's kind of how we first got linked up. And so why don't you tell that? Because we weren't there. We just heard about you afterwards, but it's kind of interesting how we ended up linking up.
Yeah. So yeah, it is. It's funny how these things go. So I went to Scotland in 2022. It was September, and which was the same time you guys were there, right? And I knew that Dale, I didn't know that I knew that you were there, but I hadn't followed you on Instagram. And I did know that Dave was there because I was following Dave on Instagram. And so basically what was happening was you guys were lifting stones in Scotland, and Barbara and I, my girl, we were about 2 days behind you guys, following you around Scotland, lifting somewhat of the same stones. So the flight home, we were flying back to Toronto, and I had a Donald Dinny t-shirt on. We were sitting at the very back of the plane, and your dad came down to just simply use the washroom. And he happened to notice my Donald Dinny t-shirt. It's he's lifting the Dinny stones in it. And he said, my son just lifted the Dinny stones. And I said, what is your son's name? And he said, Dave. And I said, yeah, I know exactly who he is. I said, I lifted the Dinny stones as well back in 2017. And he, of course, couldn't believe it because there's just not that many people that lift historical stones to begin with.
Not Canadian. We forgot to mention that you're a fellow Canadian, opposite side of the country, but still a fellow Canadian.
Yeah, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. So I live right on the ocean. My gym is approximately 500 feet from the ocean. And
cool.
And so so I said, listen, I would love to talk. Do you have time after the flight? And he said, absolutely. And so Barbara and I stopped and spoke to your parents after the flight, and we talked for, I'm sure, 10 or 15 minutes, and it was great. We had a connecting flight to get to, so we talked as long as we could. And so then Dave reached out to me on Instagram, I don't know, maybe a week or two later, something like that. And that's how we met.
Yeah, it's too funny.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Yeah, it is.
And so your first tour, you said in 2017, was in Scotland.
Yes.
And you lifted 8 stones. Is that right?
10 stones.
10 stones.
Yeah.
And then
I guess if you're going to call it Dinny stones too, right?
Sure. Yeah. That's right. Oh, it counts. And then from there, you came home and sounds like you were bit with the bug. How soon after coming back from Scotland did you start making plans to visit? Was it Iceland next or Sweden?
It was Iceland next. Yeah. So it was Iceland 2019. It was in end of May, 1st of June, and then Scotland again in 2022 in September, and then just most recently Sweden in August of 2023.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that. So the draw of Iceland was, it worked out extremely well because Stoneland comes out, and I then go to Scotland for my first time, and I have plans of going to Iceland next to attempt the Husafell Stone. And I've known about the Husafell Stone forever.
Final boss.
What's that?
That's the final boss.
Yeah,
That's the final
yeah.
boss
And
for a stone lifter. Yeah.
so I remember watching it, The World's Strongest Man in Iceland in 1992. I had watched Steve Jeck's documentary of the Husafell. It was just something that somehow I always knew about anyway, and so it became very, very natural for me to want to attempt the Husafell next. And then I heard through the grapevine that Rogue was going to be doing a documentary on the Icelandic stones. So it couldn't have worked out any better, because then I could watch the documentary. I was already preparing for Iceland to begin with, and so it just couldn't have worked out any better. I would say that I already had a deep appreciation for historical stones even before I lifted them. I revere stuff like this. I love the continuity. The tradition is incredible. The people, obviously. So the trips were exactly how I thought they would be. And somehow they have continued to be just as magical as the last. And I don't know how else to say it. It has been absolutely magical. In fact, I'll tell you about the very first historical stones that I ever lifted were the Dinnies, and I purposely didn't train for it at all. I wanted to see if I would be able to do it with zero training whatsoever. So I didn't have any loading pins. I didn't do any of those lifts. And so I'm gonna go off on a tangent just for a second. So my grandfather died 11 years ago now, and when I left the hospital, he had died of cancer. When I left the hospital, I was driving home, and above the ocean, just above the ocean that I was just talking about, 500 feet away from my gym, it was the sunlight was breaking through the dark clouds, and there were these rays, these sunbeams of light breaking through the dark clouds, and that was after immediately leaving the hospital. And so I wanted to know if I could lift the Dinnies, and again, there was only one way to answer that question. So I bought a ticket and I went. And the day that I was driving to the Dinnies to attempt them, I was by myself because I hadn't met with Martin yet. He was meeting me there. And so I was completely by myself, and I was listening to music, and I was feeling good, and I just became completely overwhelmed with emotion, thinking about my grandfather. And I thought how proud of me he would be for making it happen, for having a dream, having a question, and finding an answer to it, one way or the other. And I cried like a little baby the entire drive to the Dinnie Stones. And so when I got to the Dinnie Stones, and obviously, being an emotional wreck is not the best preparation for such a lift. So I got myself together the best I could, and I had already been in Scotland for about 4 days at that point, and I needed to, make my way up north to be able to attempt the Dinnies, and it rained the entire time. It had been raining the entire trip. Everything was wet. And so I really wasn't sure how it was going to go because it was raining, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to especially hold on to them. And I do have a very good grip, but they were wet. The rings were wet. And so I got changed into my kilt, and I went outside, and all of the clouds broke, and the sun started, breaking through the clouds just like it had that day that my grandfather had died. So it felt like he was there with me, and I had just been thinking about him for the entire drive there. And the sun broke, and it came out, and it was like a spotlight shining on me, and it stayed sunny for, 20 minutes or 30 minutes or however long it took to warm up and lift the dinnies and be done. And then it clouded back over and it was rainy and miserable for the rest of the day again. So
cool story.
yeah, so it was absolutely magical. And it's a day that I will never forget. Those were the very first stones that I ever lifted. And so that was my very first ever experience. And then on top of that, of course, so Martin Jansix is there. Brett Nickel is there. And Jim and Rosemary Splain are both there.
Yeah.
And so it's this fantastic group of people. They couldn't be any more helpful and supportive. And it just adds to the experience. And so I have this magical moment that I get to hold on to forever for the rest of my life. And so I can't say that I expected such a thing to happen. But all of my stone lifting trips somehow have been exactly what I expected them to be, which is life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is such a neat story. And it's all, I don't believe I was aware that you hadn't even trained with loading pins before.
Yeah. So, I wanted to do it, without training. I wanted to do it in the way that I thought, Donald Dinny and Robert Dinny would have done it themselves.
Sure.
And that was the best I could do. They didn't have a gym to train in, to squat and deadlift like I do. So it's certainly not the same thing. But I wanted to do it without any specific training. And I honestly had no idea whether or not I would be able to lift them.
Wow. That's really, really cool.
Yeah. Not to wax poetic on people, but really there's no more, you were saying that you wanted to have an honest answer. Were you strong enough? Yes or no? And there really is no more honest test of your strength than you versus a stone, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the variables are out of your control, other than your preparation, which in this case there was none. But for the most part, right, it's you versus a stone, and you're strong enough or you're not, and that's kind of it. Weather can have an impact, but other than that, it's are you strong enough to lift that stone? Yes or no? So
yes, and with those particular stones, I mean, they're the only thing that could really hurt you would be the rain, and making the handles wet and losing the grip. I think that would be the big thing. Other than that, of course, if you're strong enough, you're going to stand up with them.
Well, your grandfather took care of that problem for you, so.
Yeah. It was.
Right.
It's funny because he did get to see me compete in strongman.
Awesome.
But he didn't get to see me lift any historical stones or watch any of the videos. And it's amazing how much life can change in such a short time because, lifting historical stones is my favorite thing that I've ever done. And it's hard to believe that while he was alive, I didn't even really know about it. And so I'm just extremely grateful that I have found it.
Yeah, it's hear you there.
It's such a niche thing, but something that maybe, I mean, you might not know it because you're not as active on Instagram, unless you're on it, just not posting a lot. But the amount of stone lifting competitions, people who are creating their own stones of strength, the amount of sort of more mainstream podcasts, especially by way of someone like David Keown, who's such an incredible ambassador for stone lifting. Like, people are becoming more aware of stone lifting, which for me is such a great thing because it is now a shortcut for people who may have found their way to stone lifting in a meandering way, sort of like you have as the evolution of sort of your interest with strength competitions and gaining strength. People are getting exposure to it and now finding it quicker. And so the community is growing really quickly. A lot of very, very enthusiastic, passionate people are finding stone lifting, whereas, prior to Instagram and podcasts and things, they may not have. So it's pretty neat to see people, especially lifting their first stone. And just you see that sort of transformative experience that you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and anybody that has lifted stones knows exactly what that feeling feels like. And I think that there's just something about traveling to a foreign country to do it. You can't just go down to your local gym and do it on a whim. And so I think that for that simple fact, I think that most of the people that are going to travel are going to be respectful of the stones and the tradition, and they're going to know the history and the tradition of that stone. And but I agree with you. Social media is a powerful, powerful tool, and I do follow things on social media. I guess, choose to not really participate in it that much, other than just standing back and watching what's happening. And any of the communication that I have with people is almost exclusively private, by private message. But I do stay in contact with a lot of stone lifters because I love talking stone lifting. And but I am trying to open up publicly more and more because I just, again, well, what you said is that first stone, that feeling, I can obviously relate to that. And I want as many people as possible to experience that same thing because it's absolutely beautiful.
It was like that first pump you were talking about when you were a kid, getting those weights and doing bench press, right? It's that first pump feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I got to say the first pump feeling was actually very bizarre to me. The lifting stones or overcoming, an object, not even necessarily a stone, but this is obviously a stone lifting podcast. There is just something fantastic about, man versus stone. It's great.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because, strongman and stone lifting seem to go hand in hand with a lot of people. But I almost see stone lifting as strongman when it first started, because as much as I love strongman and I've competed, not at the level you have, but even most modern strongman implements are designed to be as efficient as possible, to lift it as easily as possible so the weight can go up, right, as high as possible, versus the old days was how weird or awkward is the object and can you lift it. Sure, it's a lot less in weight, but it's almost a more impressive lift because it's designed not to be lifted. And that's natural stone lifting the way that I look at it.
Yeah, I agree. And all of sports have changed in that way, that the technology of the equipment always evolves and always makes the task easier for the athlete. So it's very interesting because there was a lot of people don't even know, the history of strongman and why it started, but it's the idea of who is the strongest. Is it a bodybuilder? Is it a football player? Is it a power lifter? So let's invite all of these guys together. Let's not tell them the events, and let's see who the best is. There can be only one. And
sort of like mixed martial arts when it first came out,
original
right?
UFC.
Yeah, exactly.
People from different sporting backgrounds and combat backgrounds, and see who rises to the top. Yeah.
Yes, and as you guys well know, also triathlons. Same thing. Who's the best athlete? Is it a swimmer? Is it a cyclist? Is it a runner? Let's find out.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember seeing a video a little while ago, one of the events at World's Strongest Man, they were shoveling gravel into a basket. So it's not a bad thing that they've moved away from events like that. But I do think they make things more efficient so that the numbers can go up and the spectacle is greater. When you talk about someone doing a 1,000-pound lift, right?
Right.
It's same as a lot of sort of assisted powerlifting styles. It's impressive. It's incredible, but it's not the same sort of physically demanding thing as you versus a stone. So
strongman has changed a tremendous amount, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here. It is interesting though, natural stones are making their way back into strongman competitions in recent times, and there's always been almost trends in certain lifts in strongman throughout its entire history. And I think that that's true of any other sport as well, where there are choices to be made. And it's going to be interesting to see where strongman goes from here. But I do think that if you're doing a 1 rep max in the deadlift or in the log or something like that, it puts butts in seats and sells tickets. And, that it is a business.
Sure.
Yeah, and we've talked about it before, but was it 2019 Arnold's where they lifted the odd Hogan's tombstone?
Yeah.
And it showed you how hard it was for these world-class strength athletes to lift that stone, which in some cases was maybe only slightly above their own body weight. Now, of course, these are giant men, But you see people on Instagram quite often lifting stones that are the same as their body weight, greater, and in some cases, like David's lifted a stone that's twice his body weight. So it
Yeah.
shows you. So stone lifting is very different. It's something you have to really practice and you have to train for.
Its
So
own specialty.
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree. And I do think that as these competitions happen with stones more regularly, you are going to see the athletes rise, um,
yeah,
and you're going to see them practice the lifts more. That's the thing with an Atlas stone. It's a standardized piece of equipment, and they allow tacky, and so a round concrete ball is the same no matter where you are, right?
right, right.
So it's
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, just in talking about something, stones being something you have to practice and train for, like you're obviously a very measured and calculated person. And as you've said before, when you go on these stone tours, you really kind of get a very, very small window with these stones where you have to figure them out and
Yeah,
lift them. It's not something that you can try, go to max effort, fail, come back a couple days later, try again, try again. You've got to read the stone. You've got to lift the stone as quickly and efficiently as possible to preserve yourself for the next stone. So how did you go about, let's say, for example, for Iceland and prepping for the Husafell? How did you go about programming and training for that stone, knowing that, you had one crack and in your instance, you were successful at getting it all the way around the pin?
yeah. So I would say that Iceland is the one trip that would be the exception to the other trips, the other stone lifting trips that I've done. Um, when I went to Iceland, the sole task was the Husafell Stone. That was the sole reason that I was going. And although I, of course, planned to attempt the other stones, if I had only lifted or only had my chance, my opportunity at the Husafell Stone, I would have been okay with that. So it's somewhat of a bad example of how I would typically prepare for a stone lifting tour. But to still use Iceland as the example, I purposely chose to lift the Husafell first. And it's funny because you say you have one crack at it. I purposely attempted it on early in the trip, so that way, if I didn't lift it, I would potentially have a chance to go back. Um,
Right.
because
Smart.
with a stone like that, especially a carrying stone where grip is such a factor, learning the stone is unbelievably important, much more important than it would be for a stone that you're just standing up with, right?
Yeah.
So you could potentially lift the Husafell in not necessarily the easiest way to get the best grip. So it really depends on the stone. Normally, if I'm lifting any, let's say, other stones where I'm only attempting to stand up with them, as you guys know, there are 10 ways that you could lift a stone.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sure that the Husafell is, I'm sure that pertains to the Husafell as well. In fact, I would say that because of its shape, it can probably be carried more ways than other stones, because it's flat and triangular like.
Yeah.
So I would say that with the Husafell, the Husafell is my greatest accomplishment in my life as far as I'm concerned, and I just don't think that I'm ever going to. I mean, I'm going to try to find other things, but I don't know if it's going to happen. That's how important that stone is for me. Um, there is something about so Martin Janciks and Bill Crawford wrote a stone lifting book, as I'm sure you guys know.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Bill Crawford wrote in that book was, to believe in yourself, but also doubt every step of the way and to not know. Um, it's such an unusual thing. And that's exactly how I felt. I felt as though I was training as hard as I possibly could. I felt like I was preparing myself as much as I possibly could in every possible way, every way that I could think of, every way that I could, not just my own thoughts, but I spoke to other people. I was open to any suggestions on training methods to be able to conquer the Husafell. And so I was very strong with carrying stones. I had a great history of doing well in the Husafell carry in strongman. Um, I actually won the Husafell carry at the Canadian Championships under 90 kilos, which is the weight class I competed in.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so I knew that I was good at it, but I had tremendous doubt, and I had doubt right up until I did it. In fact, when I first put my hands on the stone in Iceland, I didn't think that I had any chance of doing it. It's unbelievably rounded on its edges and slick and smooth. It feels like it has absolutely nothing to grab a hold of. And I felt as though if I could get the stone into my lap and stand up with it, that I would be able to walk it around because I'm very strong with the walking part of the lift. But I was very concerned about picking the stone. And I had purposely trained the pick with an emphasis on the pick the entire preparation for that reason. Also, I wanted to be able to, it didn't make any sense to me to go to Iceland and only be able to, let's say, you know, you guys good?
Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
I gotta just take a pause for a sec. I'm looking for what you-
Take your time.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate this. This is fun. It's nice to talk shop.
It is. It is. I actually feel like, if anything, we're probably not going to have enough time to talk about everything.
No, and that's what I was saying. I think I was texting that yesterday. I'm like, I'm sure this will be the first of many with you, just because it's we usually try and keep them, around an hour 20ish. We're not trying to do the Rogan 3 hour things, and
Yep.
only so much we can talk about. But you've got a lot to offer, so we'll be able to come back, and we got all the time, man. I'm sure people want to hear more and more and more. But
Sounds good.
yeah, it's fun, man. It's so easy to talk about this stuff. It's just like our conversation. It's just recorded.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I really appreciate the opportunity because and this is something that we're definitely going to talk about much more going forward, because, and I don't know if you've listened to my last messages or not, but
I haven't listened to the last one. I got about halfway through one, and then the kids took over my time this afternoon. You were talking about your loadable Atlas stone, and you're very happy with it.
yeah, it's extremely cool. I would highly recommend it. I think it's going to be, this is the thing, right? Always trying to learn, always trying to, what's the next thing, right? I think it's going to be a fantastic tool to be able. Thor is the current world's strongest man at that time, and he's attempting to defend his crown in approximately 3 weeks from that day. And so he's 455 pounds. I asked him how much he weighed. And so this is prime Thor. He's the world's strongest man. And he's doing strict log with 390, and he's doing triples with it. And so it's the day before I'm going to attempt the Husafell. So I'm doing a very light, easy shoulder workout, just to really see Thor's gym, and luckily Thor happens to be there. So this was his first gym. He's now in a bigger location, and I haven't been to that gym. But the old gym was quite small. It was actually smaller than my gym, and he only had one adjustable bench. So it was a rogue bench that went flat, all the way up to shoulder press. And so I was doing some shoulder presses, and when he finished log pressing, he did multiple sets with the 390 strict press. And he was then going to do steep incline dumbbell presses. And he came over, and he knew that I was using the bench. He knew that I was using the bench, and he asked me if I was done with the bench, which I thought was fantastic. Because it's his gym. He's literally the world's strongest man, and he's being polite enough to ask. And I say, I'm actually not done with the bench. However, you take it, and you just let me know when you're done, and it's all good. So it was quite funny. He proceeded to do 100 kilogram dumbbells, so 221 pounds in each hand for his work set. I think he did 4 reps.
Oh.
Yeah, so completely crazy stuff.
Ridiculous.
So once he finishes his training session, only then I asked him for a photograph, because I didn't want to bother him while he was training. And I told him that I was there to attempt the Husafell the following day, and I asked if he had any advice to give, because he was also the world record holder for the greatest distance carried with the actual Husafell stone. And he said, He said, he said, I will give you some advice. He said, the stone is very top heavy. He said, so what happens is people attempt to pick it, and as soon as it leaves the earth, it immediately falls forward. And he said, in his opinion, a lot of people just simply give up on the lift at that time because the stone is literally falling away from them. He said, so you need to fight the stone, keep fighting the stone, and if you're strong enough, you'll be able to stand up with it. Because I had voiced my concerns about whether or not I was going to be able to pick it, and I felt as though I was strong enough to be able to walk it around. But again, of course, I'm not sure, and that's the whole point of being there. And so he said, it's a very difficult stone. He said, in fact, I brought Larry Wheels there, and Larry Wheels could not do it. And I couldn't believe it because Larry Wheels is a 900-pound, at that time, 900-pound deadlifter, 900-pound squatter. And he had attempted it and he couldn't do it. I didn't ask, and Thor did not elaborate on how he failed. I'm certainly sure that he would be able to stand up with it. I'm guessing he just couldn't walk it around. And so the next day, Barbara and I go to Jean-Paul Sigmason's grave on the way, and we pay our respects, and we then drive to Husafell, and the GPS coordinates were wrong. They actually told us that the stone was on the opposite side of the road, so we had to look for it for a little bit. And when we finally found it, it's an incredible location, absolutely stunning and barren. And I started warming up, and when I first touched the stone, I thought that I didn't have a chance. The stone was so rounded and so smooth with no handles whatsoever that I thought that I didn't have a chance of getting the stone onto my lap. And so, of course, that's what I'm there to do. I warm up and I have to find out, an answer to my question. And so I warm up and I feel pretty good during warm-ups. And I had purposely put a huge emphasis on the pick when preparing for the Husafell, because I didn't want to go there and be strong enough to carry it all the way around, but not be strong enough to display that because I can't get the thing into my lap. So it made more sense to purposely train the pick. And, even if I can carry it 10 feet, that's certainly better than not being able to get the thing off the ground. Yeah. So I put a huge emphasis on the pick. I trained the two halves of the lift completely separated. In fact, I literally never did a carry when picking it from the ground in the first place. I kept them completely separate. And it worked extremely well because I got much, much stronger in the pick. My particular loadable Husafell stone is very, very big, which definitely makes it more difficult than most. And it's just, I made it when there were no dimensions on the internet. And so I just had to guess. And I would say that it's at least as thick as the real stone itself. So it was more difficult to pick an equivalent weight than the real Husafell itself. And so I warmed up, and to my surprise, on my first attempt, it popped up onto my lap somewhat easily. And I really got to say, I think I was in shock. And I had polyester pants. They were very, very slippery, which is funny because I thought about wearing my kilt, and I purposely chose to not wear the kilt because I thought that it would be more difficult and add an element of difficulty to the lift. And these polyester pants were far worse. They were just a pair of gym pants. And so I couldn't stand up with the stone. I couldn't take a step. I lost my balance trying to flip the stone upward, erect, and I lost my balance and the stone almost fell on me. I fell backwards with the stone, and I was fortunate enough to be able to dump it out of the way completely unharmed. And so I made a second attempt. The same thing happened, but this time I get it onto my lap. I can't stand up with it. I can't get the stone erect. I don't even bother to waste any energy trying to really wrestle the stone because I know that it's a lost cause. And so I immediately drop it, put it down, and then Barbara says, "Why don't you try some jeans? Why don't you wear your jeans?" And I thought, that is brilliant. And I put my jeans on.
That's my go-to.
Yeah. And again, my buddy Terry McKay says you did it like a real farmer. right?
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
so I put the jeans on and I chalked up, and on my third attempt, that made all the difference in the world. I do think actually in retrospect that a kilt would have been fine if it was short enough for the stone to get onto this, the skin of my thighs. I
Yeah.
think that would actually work very well, if the kilt was short enough. So once I stood up with it, I felt very, very confident. It felt pretty good actually, but I did recognize that I was moving too slowly. And I think that that is something that is really important, to hear for anybody that's thinking about training for the Husafell and attempting it. So I'll go off on a tangent just for a second here. Um,
Please do.
I watched as many videos as I possibly could. I timed all of them. I counted the strides, the steps that people took. And I noticed a pattern that everybody that did it without it in one pick, without dropping it, just in one carry, did it from 21 seconds to 32 seconds. So during my preparation, I purposely went with the longer time duration, and I did every single carry for at least 30 seconds to get used to that duration. I think that people don't look at it as a speed event, but it is. Of course, when you pick it up, you have a finite amount of time before that is going to drop from your arms.
Yeah.
And for most people, I think that the weak link is going to be the arms. It's going to slip out of their arms somehow. And so you need to get it done as fast as you possibly can. So I think that if you look at it more from a speed event, even though it's not being timed, I think that that's a better way of training it. And so
So you weren't training for distance, you were training specifically for time in the carry position.
correct. So,
Yeah.
like, it's nobody, for some reason, nobody has actually measured the distance around the pen. It seems like there's conflicting numbers as to how far around the pen is. Um, so one thing I will say is the pen is very, very small in person, but that's deceptive because you're not walking around the pen where the stones are. You're walking, let's say 5 or 6 feet away from those stones. So the circle that you're going to make is actually much bigger than the pen itself. But it
Mhm.
doesn't look like it certainly doesn't look like it's nearly as far around as the numbers that I've read. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so in training, in preparation for it, I would purposely walk for 30 seconds, even if I was able to double the distance of the pen. I couldn't care less. It was the time. I wanted to make sure that I was capable of walking for that period of time. And so then I knew that it didn't really matter what the distance was because I would be able to hold on to it for, let's say, 30 seconds.
Mhm.
And so I purposely went with worst case scenario. And I did do walks right up until I did walks up to 400 pounds in training as well. And again, that's with my loadable. I didn't do any walks with stones. Um, I purposely only used the loadable Husafell that I had, and I did go as heavy as 400 pounds. Um, I think the heaviest walk that I did do for the time duration though, for the 30 seconds, I think was 350 pounds. The 400 pounds, I was not able to walk that duration, but it was, and this was, I think, somewhat of a mistake. It was my very first time training outside, and I was walking on grass, and it was wet. And I do highly recommend that anybody that wants to attempt the Husafell, they do walk in a circle. It is completely different, and I didn't have any chalk. And it made a massive difference because my Husafell is painted and it's very, very slick. So I think that 400 pounds in my loadable Husafell is actually far more difficult than the Husafell Stone itself.
Right.
So yeah, so I started walking as fast as I possibly could. And even within the first 10 feet, I recognized that I wasn't walking fast enough. And as you know, you have time to have the longest conversation in the world with yourself. And so I say, you got to pick up speed, and I start faster steps. And then I settle in, and it feels very good. And I get exactly halfway. And I am so confident because I know that I'm halfway, and I know I'm going to be able to do it because it feels so solid. And as soon as that thought enters my mind, the stone immediately slips.
Yeah.
And
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and usually with a stone like that, it immediately falls out of your arms. You can't really save it. Luckily, I was able to save it, and I stopped very quickly, very briefly, and just reset my grip. And as soon as I stood up, I absolutely knew that I was going to be able to finish it because I was locked in. It was no longer in a position that it could slip, and I carried it around. I completed the lap, and I put it down, and I know for sure that I could have gone farther. I have no idea if I could have gone any, I don't know if I could have gone another quarter lap, another lap and a half. I have no idea. And I actually like not knowing. And I have no intentions on ever lifting that stone again. I
Yeah.
Well, and the reason why is because I don't want to. The moment was so magical for me that I don't want to ruin it. I want to leave it as a singular moment in my life, and I could go there and I could carry it for 2 laps, and it would not be as good of an
Yeah.
accomplishment as the first time I did it. Just because you cannot replicate that first experience, you only get that first time once.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple. I took a few notes there just in that discussion there, and I'll touch back on them. So you mentioned about the distance around, and there's definitely varying distances that I've read and I've heard of. And I thought of Ryan Stewart when you mentioned that, just pulling his mustache hairs out. But he, because I messaged Ryan, and he said with full
Ryan
confidence.
does have a fantastic mustache.
What's that?
Ryan does have a fantastic mustache.
It's top. It looks good there.
He says with the confidence that Ryan says things with that it is 98 feet around. So I'm not sure if they measured it, but because I'd asked him, I said I've read 120 feet, and he said it is 98 feet around. Being said, yeah, so he said that with full confidence, and I didn't grill him. I take like everything. I take Ryan at his word because he knows his stuff, but. With that being said, there's 2 other things I wanted to touch on. As you and I discussed the Husafell in detail, probably coming up to a year ago, and you had mentioned the 30-second of training thing, training time. And so I've kind of done, I'm nowhere near ready for the Husafell yet, but there's 2 things I've been implementing in my training. Number 1 is training with time. So when I train in my garage gym, even if I do a lot of yoke carries just to get my frame ready for the weight, and I make sure that I'm doing it's just forward and back, but I'm doing it slower, but making sure my time is there, and that I definitely feel the endurance coming from that. But then I also, where we do our stone lifting, we do laps around. There's picnic tables there, and we've measured them, and I think they're between 75 and 80 feet, so just shy of what the Husafell is. But it's absolutely a different thing walking in a circle. You're twisting, you're twisting. The way that your hips have to take the weight, the way that your body actually carries the weight, everything is different. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is the time under tension is an amazing element to keep in the back of your mind, but also, again, I haven't done the Husafell yet, but it is a huge difference training in a circle. And it's, you got to practice all of the, if you want to nail it, you got to practice all the elements, or at least that's the way that I'm trying to.
I agree. And I think that training in your basement and having a short run with multiple turns, with more turns than you would normally have, I think is a very good way to train, actually. And I have specifically trained that way on purpose, because turning is by far the most difficult thing.
Terrible.
Yeah, it is, because you have to decelerate, you have to hit your line. If you have a line that you're crossing with your foot, you then have to turn your body around, and then you have to create some momentum, and you have to start accelerating. And you start decelerating like quite a good distance before you get to the line. So there really is a lot of movement, a lot more movement than in a regular carry. And certainly a walk is just a completely different animal again. To go back to Ryan's distance of 98 feet, do you know if that is the stones themselves or where you actually walk?
Your path of travel.
That's your path of travel, is my understanding. And
okay.
I'll obviously follow up with Ryan, but he didn't even hesitate. He didn't flinch. He said it's 98 feet around. And
yeah, it's definitely shorter than, and I definitely believe that number. The number that was always thrown out there was, and was generally accepted, was 50 meters, so approximately 150 feet. And
Yeah.
I've heard that before.
I definitely agree that it's not that. So I have a 40-foot track in my gym where I was doing my walks, and I was doing 160 feet. So a turn every 40 feet. And that was taking me approximately 30 seconds at the speed that I was able to go. But the turns really slow you down. So like if you're doing only, let's say 20 feet, then you're not going to be able to cover nearly as much distance. And of course, to exaggerate the point, if you were to walk 160 feet straight in a line, you'd be able to do it much, much faster.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's something really interesting you touched on, and it's maybe it's a great takeaway for any stone lifter who is trying to lift a stone and is unable to do so, is self-reflection and examining those points of failure. So as you did when you were reviewing video of other people, realizing that really it's not the distance that was stopping people, it was their ability to hold that weight for 20 to 30 seconds, right? The point of failure wasn't their legs or their hips or their glutes, it was their wrists or their forearms. And it's something that I think a lot of people do maybe when they're lifting stones is take a look and say, the reason I couldn't lift that stone, it might not be because I couldn't, it doesn't mean go back to the gym and do heavier squats or heavier deadlifts. Take a look and figure out what it was about that lift that caused you to fail. Was it your wrist? Was it your drive off of the floor? Was it engaging your hips or your glutes when you were trying to stand with it? Like, break things down and take that analytical approach, because that'll really help you, because it is, as David has said many times, it's a strength puzzle. So you have to treat it and break it down as a puzzle. Look at the individual pieces and how they fit together to make the full picture. And that's how you figure out why it is you're not being successful for certain stones or certain lifts.
I agree, and especially the Husafell. I really like the term strength puzzle as well. I think that that's a fantastic term. So I think that because the distance is so short with the real stone, I think that most of the time the failure is in the arms and not really in the body. I think that when you are carrying, let's say, a lighter stone for a greater distance, where you're able to hold it in your arms, and the limiting factor is not the arms as much as it is the distance itself, especially if you're doing a max carry. Then I think that that's when the glutes and the hamstrings start to fatigue. And I also think that a factor, especially with a lot of the big guys that try the Husafell, is they gas out pretty quickly. I think that that's a factor as well. And I think that being able to relax and breathe when carrying the stone is an incredibly, incredibly important thing. I realized, I just discovered this when training the Husafell one time, a long time ago, for a strongman competition, having the stone on my chest. So naturally, the more you lean back, the more weight you of that stone you feel on your body. So it takes the weight off of the arms, which is of course good for the arms, but bad for the body and bad for breathing. And so what I discovered is I wasn't relaxing as much as I could. And so I purposely and consciously tried to relax more and more. And I really tried to push it and see how much I could relax. And it's interesting because you can relax, or at least I could, far more than I thought that I would be able to. You would think that if you're carrying a 410-pound stone that you're not going to be able to relax, but you can, especially if you train yourself to do so. And so I think that that's a big factor. I think that a lot of people are squeezing it as tight as they possibly can from the get-go, and I think that's a mistake. I think they're better off actually holding on to it as loosely as possible. A good example would be if you are hanging from a chin-up bar, let's say, for maximum time. If you squeeze the bar as hard as you possibly can from the very first second, you might only be able to hold on for 30 seconds because you're trying as hard as you possibly can and you're fatiguing those muscles faster. If you were to hang from that bar with the least amount of effort possible, and then only gradually increase your squeeze as you need it, you will inevitably be able to hold on to that bar much, much longer. I think it's similar to that. Of course, you don't want to hold on to it too lightly because the stone may slip. So I think you could make the argument perhaps that I hadn't held on to the stone as tightly as I should have, which is maybe why it moved. I don't know. But
No,
it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting stone because there aren't a lot of carrying stones, and it's a completely different element that is completely different than just standing up with a stone.
no, that's a good point, though. Don't create fatigue. Don't create fatigue that's not already there by way of what you're doing. So.
And that makes, I was actually writing something down here to remember to bring up, and you kind of covered it, but then made a great analogy with the hanging part. Because let's say you're 200 pounds and your hands need to hold on to 200 pounds, 100 each hand to make sure you don't fall. If you're squeezing with, 125 pounds per hand, you're going to fatigue a lot more because you're doing that much more work than you actually need to sustain it. And that's kind of an interesting balance that I'm trying to find right now with my training is, so when I'm carrying a stone, like I did about 80 feet with a 355 pound stone, and it took the wind out of me. Like it wasn't my muscles. It was the crushing sensation on my chest. But then I went home, and within a month or whatever it was, and I put 410 pounds in my loadable Husafell, and I was able to carry it 80 feet, pardon me. And so I don't know if because of the shape of the stone, I was able to take more in my arms and therefore less on my body, crushing me less, or what it was. But that's kind of the interesting battle that I'm having, where I think I have the strength to carry it, but it's if I lean too far back, then I'm getting smothered. Like that's the weight of a black bear on your chest, right? So I've got to maybe focus more on what you're saying is lean a little bit more forward, have faith in your arm strength, and stop using your chest as like the mat for it to lay on and walk.
Well, I think I would say that it's more individual than that, but I would agree for the most part that I think a person you may need to lean back more than other people and so on. But I think that everybody needs to relax as much as they possibly can and go as fast as they possibly can with their feet. And those would be the big things. I think that there's like even the arms. Like a lot of people carry the Husafell in their hands, and I prefer to carry it in more what I would call my hooks. So more, exactly. Yeah. But with that said, the Husafell itself, I ended up carrying it more in my hands rather than those hooks, even though I wanted those hooks because of the shape and size of the stone. And I might, if I had attempted the stone again, perhaps I would have carried it a different way because that particular stone can be carried many different ways. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, you're going to be able to regulate your grip, and you're going to be able to, if hanging from a bar, you're going to be able to feel how much you need to squeeze. Whereas with a stone, you're not necessarily going to know, and it's certainly better to err on squeezing a little bit too hard rather than not hard enough, because then it will fall. And that's where practice with that particular stone would make a huge difference. And I think that that's one of the big problems with the Husafell is that it's so heavy that you don't get the opportunity to do very many attempts because it's going to gas you out. You're going to attempt it and it's going to gas you out, and you're probably not going to have that many quality attempts with that stone. Again, it's completely different than a stone that you're just standing up with. Walking a stone, let's say you walk it 3/4 of the way and you drop it, and now you're going to attempt to do a full circle with it. You're probably gassed, and it's going to be extremely difficult for you. And you may have been strong enough to do it fresh, but perhaps that time is past now.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a very, very good point.
Your issue with breathing, though, so if you had a two-dimensional figure like I do, that problem isn't as bad. So when you have a concave chicken chest, you can put the Husafell across your shoulders. It's in contact with the front of your shoulders, and you've got about 4 inches of space within which your chest can rise and fall without hitting the stone. So
I wish that was the case.
I've figured it out.
Okay, I like it.
Well, one thing is true for sure is that practice is going to help no matter what, because even if you're, as long as you're willing to experiment and be open-minded, I think that is where you're going to learn. And if you're lucky enough to have people that you train with that have an educated eye, whether it be a coach or whether it's a person in person, the combination of those things, I think, is going to be what's really going to allow you to get the most out of your body. It's again, a stone carry is a completely different animal, and there's a lot of big guys that can't carry the Husafell. and it's an extremely well. It's the ultimate. It's the ultimate carrying stone for sure.
Sure. Yeah. This conversation actually, I'm in the squirrel mode of the season for stone lifting, where
Collecting and stashing them wherever you can.
Our Alberta winter is coming on. Realistically, the forecast for 10 days looks good, but by the end of October, we're lucky if we don't have snow here. I'm not sure what it's quite like for you out east, but so I've been in overtime finding stones, like, because I don't want to pull too much away from our stones where we keep at our sites. But there is one that we call the coal miners carry, and that's one I've posted, and it's 355 pounds. You and I have discussed this one. It's very similar in height pick for the Husafell, and I thought just training with my my loadable Husafell would be a really good option for all winter. But that 355 pound stone is significantly harder to pick than the actual loadable Husafell, so I may have to squirrel that one away in my garage for the winter just to make it a more difficult pick and carry. Because if the actual Husafell tends to be more like my loadable Husafell, well, then I'm in a much better place than the opposite. So I think if I train a little bit harder, and then that way we can work on picks, and might be a good way to have that little guy tucked away in the garage for the winter.
It's definitely better to be over prepared. That's for sure. And I think that you want to make sure that you're as strong as you possibly can be. And like I'm lucky enough that I have stones inside of the gym. I can lift them all winter long at any time, and I can even do carries if I choose to. So I'm very fortunate in that way. I think that as long as you're training hard and as long as you're training consistent, that will give you enough exposure to figure things out and what works best for you. And that does take a long time. And I think with the carry part of it, I've always been pretty good at that. I tend to be good at the events where grit matter. That was definitely my strong suit for sure. And so like farmers walks, long farmers walks, and stuff like that. The stone that you have, I think it's a fantastic shape, and it looks very similar to the Husafell. And the Husafell is very, very flat, so it feels actually quite good on the chest, and it also is carried just because of its shape. It's not typically as tall, top to bottom, as a loadable Husafell stone. So it doesn't ever really get in the way of your legs, which is a huge problem with a loadable Husafell. And so if you have a natural stone and there's a very concentrated surface area that's pressing against your torso, that's going to knock the wind out of you much, much quicker than the Husafell, the real stone.
Okay, so then I'm going to get that one. That's
Dave the Stone Squirrel.
I am a stone. That's pretty accurate. It's ridiculous, but it's fun. It's half the fun for me with all this stuff, the Edmonton Stones of Strength, because we just have it's honestly 2-minute drive from our house. As we've talked about before in this, there's tons of stones everywhere, and it's just too much fun to be digging them up and finding, because a strength puzzle, everyone is different, and it's so fun to find these new ones. And I don't know, it's so much of the fun for me.
Yeah, I agree. It's it's my favorite thing that I've ever done, and I just think it's amazing to be able to fly to these foreign countries and feel like you're on this real life adventure and a treasure hunt for these stones, and you've never seen them before, and even finding the stone and immersing yourself into their culture, driving on the wrong side of the road. Like I said, it's all of those things and all the people that you meet. And, like some of my best experiences have been meeting complete strangers whom I will never meet again. And having this intimate and brief connection, and finding these stones and reading these stones and solving this strength puzzle, as you say. And then conquering that stone and putting your name on that same stone that so many men have lifted, for hundreds of years in some cases before you. The entire thing, it's just magical.
Yeah, and so you've talked about how you would never go back to the Husafell because nothing would ever top that initial feeling you had with your first successful lift there. What brought you back to Scotland for your second trip?
So there were, I lifted in the first trip more of the, I guess you would call them more well-known stones.
Yeah.
And so the second trip was to lift some of the not as popular stones, but the trip was just as magical nonetheless. Um, it was, I did go back to the Dinny stones, but not to lift them, just to be there. And Barbara hadn't been with me on the first trip, and so it was a great way for her to see the stones and for us to experience the place, and walk across the bridge. And it's a beautiful place. And but yeah, I have no intentions on ever attempting the Husafell again. Again, I'm so happy with that singular experience. I don't want to blemish it in any kind of way. And it's that stone for me that is, I can't really explain to you why it's so special to me. It's because I don't know if I can actually articulate why. I don't even know if I know why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think some of the magic
So
that comes around the uncertainty, right? So, for example, you did the Dinny stones without direct specific training for the Dinny stones, but even with the direct specific training for the Husafell, there was still a lot of uncertainty and doubt in your mind as to whether or not you would get it up. Even after trying to lift it a couple of times, that doubt was still there. So I
yeah.
think that's why it was such a magical moment that doesn't warrant trying to be recreated. So
Yeah, I think that because the Dinny stones are as old as the hills as well.
yeah,
So there's a tremendous amount of tradition there as well. But again, for some reason, that I was just drawn to the Husafell stone, and it was yeah. I have attempted a lot of stones in these trips that I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to lift them because of the circumstances, because of the weather, especially. Some of these stones, when they're wet, like I had a very difficult time with the Glenroy stones in my first trip because they were soaking wet, and they are not extremely heavy stones, but they were very difficult. Even something very light like the Newtonmore stone. Um, it was muddy. It was covered in mud. That stone was unbelievably hard. It weighs 100 kilograms. It's 222, I believe, is the exact weight.
yeah,
Um, that was an unbelievably slippery stone, and it's 222. So there's just anything that can happen on these trips, and so I have encountered doubt on every single trip and multiple times in a trip. But again, for some reason, the Husafell is just different for me. I really didn't know if I was going to be able to do it, and I trained extremely hard for it. And like you said, I did train specifically for it, unlike the Denny Stones. And I just didn't know. And I almost can't believe that I did it in some way. It almost seems as though it was this out of body experience, that it wasn't me that did it somehow. And I don't know how else I could possibly describe it. Because again, I don't know if I necessarily fully understand it myself. It felt transcending to me, is what it felt like. I felt like it changed me as a person somehow, and that I was a different person when I came back home.
Wow, that's cool. It was so powerful for you.
Yeah.
You had said something a couple minutes ago, and I had to write it down because I kind of had a sea change in my mind throughout our Scotland trip without realizing it. And I'll circle back to your point here, and I'm wondering if it has any importance to you. When we first planned on going to Scotland, and I was, training for it and telling people about it, trying to justify why I was going, is I thought originally it would be cool to be able to test myself against these men, these warriors of the past. But I didn't even know that I'd had a perspective change until you said something a few minutes ago, and I realized on that trip, it wasn't about me testing myself against these men of the past. It was about being a part of the tradition, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't even, until you said something, I didn't even realize my brain had switched gears with that, where it's about just being a part of it. But I'm wondering, maybe part of the reason why the Husafell was so particularly special for you is that because that was truly maybe towards more of a test for yourself. Of course, you want to be a part of the tradition, but that was like the highest level of test. So not only did you become a part of the history and the tradition of it, but it was the highest level of testing yourself for it, and you proved something to yourself in doing so.
Yeah, I think that is very insightful. I think that it is some of that, certainly, because um, I don't know how I would have felt if I had failed at lifting some of the stones that I've attempted, because again, I've been lucky enough I haven't failed one yet. Um, uh, there have been a couple of stones that I have had to attempt. I think 5 or 6 times a couple of stones took me 5 or 6 attempts. And when you're attempting so many stones on a tour, you can't really afford to do that. Now that's only happened a couple of times, but um, I think that it doesn't matter how strong you are. There's a stone out there that's big enough that you're not going to be able to lift it.
Yeah.
And I think that the Husafell, I think that it was the greatest challenge and the greatest challenge that I've ever faced. And I just think I had more doubt in that than anything I've ever done. And I just really didn't know if I was going to be able to do it, and simultaneously believed in myself. And it was this curious combination of things. And again, if you can read it, that's what Bill Crawford talks about. And those words resonated with me so much because he had obviously experienced the same thing that I had. And again, it was just a magical moment. And I will remember it for the rest of my days. I plan on actually, I wore a Jones Gym t-shirt when I did it. And I took the shirt off and I didn't wear it for the rest of the trip. So I've worn that shirt only to do the Husafell. And I am going to be buried in that shirt. That's my plan.
Awesome. That is really cool.
Yeah.
No, I didn't think about that. Is we wore Edmonton Stones of Strength shirt all throughout Scotland, but I don't.
Family kilts.
Yeah, I have a couple of different versions of that shirt. I don't know which one we wore to Scotland now.
I know I've got.
I wasn't thinking ahead like you were.
Mine's got a couple holes in it. So that, I think, just to one final point on the whole historical stone lifting tour aspect of things, and David, you kind of summarize it, and just to say, when you're going and lifting these stones, it's not you competing or comparing yourselves to the lifters of the past. It's you becoming one of them, right? It's you becoming one of the lifters of that stone. And that's why it's very important that as you go out and you experience a stone tour and lift these stones, that you treat them with as much respect as possible, so that other people in the future, hopefully hundreds if not thousands of years in the future, can have that same experience. So
I absolutely agree. And I hope that the Husafell is around for a long time. I hope that people continue to have the opportunity to test themselves, test their mettle on that stone, because it's such a perfect test. It's a sheep's pen. It's a stone that has been wrestled down from the mountains to be used as a gate. It's just a ridiculous story. It's fantastic and it's charming.
It's a story that has become a legend. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of it's the same thing as June Richards, the caretaker of the Inverstone. And so, the fact that some of the strongest men in the world travel to Scotland, to her house, to her garden, to attempt to lift the Inverstone, there's something that's absolutely charming about that entire thing. I just love the idea of it, that these guys in kilts are knocking on her door and asking permission to lift a rock that's in her garden, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, it's absurd, the entire thing, right? And they are just rocks, but it's just like they say in Stoneland, they're just rocks to anybody passing by. But it's the people and the tradition and the history and everything that goes with it that creates so much more meaning than it just being a simple stone. And I think it's lovely that they honored June in the way that they did. And after you lift the stone, like I was fortunate enough to be able to be invited into her home with Martin and sign the book, and she offered me a cup of tea, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah,
And I think that, yeah, it's there's just something about that is just it's just great. And I think that the absurdity of stone lifting is actually part of the charm. Um,
yeah.
so when we were just in Sweden, we went to a we went to a stone, and it was fantastic. The lady there, so it was a husband and wife and a son, and the son could speak English, but the husband and wife, the mom and dad, um, they couldn't.
Yeah.
So the son, he was translating for us, and his mom, the wife, had said to us, "Don't you have rocks in Canada?" And it's true. It's a fantastic line. It's hilarious, but it's true, because why would somebody travel from Canada, in this example, to Sweden to lift rocks? And
Yeah.
why specifically to lift a rock that's in her backyard? What makes that one so special, right? Well, it's the
Yeah.
people that make those stones special. And it's the history and the tradition and the story and the continuity of that stone. It has its own story. And if you are lucky enough to put your hands on that particular stone, whether you lift it or not, you become part of that stone's history.
Absolutely.
Love
That's beautifully
that.
put. Yeah. I think before we close out for the episode, I mean, I became aware not of you, but maybe of your methods before we even interacted. When I was training some with David for Alberta Strongest Viking, and at that time, you were coaching him, and
Yeah.
I know like your approach to the way that you're coaching, very analytical, very hands-on. You're having him record and document all of his lists that you could review and help him improve. Do you want to maybe let everybody know a bit about what you do as a coach in your gym and anything else that's going on in your life?
Yeah. So I don't train very many people at the gym, and I do that on purpose. I'm fortunate enough to be able to make a living in my hometown, and that's really all I'm looking to do. Um,
Yeah.
Especially where I live, there's a lot of guys that need to travel out of the province, actually, to Alberta.
My way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
to be able to work and to be able to make a living. And so
Yeah.
I feel very fortunate to be able to make a living in my own hometown. I love it here. I was born and raised here, and I have no plans on going anywhere. And so I train enough people to pay the bills, and and that's it. As far as training Dave goes, like that was fantastic for me, because I've had numerous coaches through the years. Actually, I'll name them because they were all great guys. Mike Westerling was my first coach, specifically for strongman. And Mike actually helped Brian Shaw prepare for the World's Strongest Man just a few years ago. Mike's a fantastic coach and a fantastic guy. And my second coach was Mike Mistel, and he was a pro strongman as a 231. Again, fantastic guy, very analytical, very methodical, just a fantastic guy to work with. And my most recent coach was Andrew Clayton, and Andrew, same thing, just brilliant. He just, I think, sees more than other people. I think that and he's uh, multiple time world champion as a 105 strongman. So he's as good as anybody, but a fantastic coach, fantastic human being. And I couldn't be more lucky with all three coaches that I've had, and I've tried to learn as much as I possibly can from those guys. And so I think that with time, that's exactly how it happens. You draw from whoever you can and wherever you can, and I've been very fortunate to expedite that process by having such great coaches. And so for me to be able to do programming for you, Dave, like for a strongman competition, was fantastic, because I had never prepared. Well, I guess I had prepared a couple of people for strongman competitions before, but not like this, and not remotely. And that's how I worked with all of my coaches. And so it was just a role reversal that was a fantastic experience and a bunch of fun. And It's great stuff. I do think that if somebody can afford it, that hiring a knowledgeable coach really does expedite the entire process. Um, Even if it's somebody that is going to collaborate with you,
Mhm.
and not necessarily dictate to you what you need to do. Two heads are better than one, and a pair of educated eyes watching your lips. Um, it's it expedites the entire thing. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that was a fun process, and that was for the third strongest Viking competition, and I got the title back by quite a big margin, which was
Yeah,
really satisfying. But it was fun talking to you when I was telling you the events, and you said, some of them were very unique events, like the
yeah,
press of the log, a 200, then it'd be an 180-pound just log,
It's strong. Yeah.
chunk of tree, no handle, nothing. And so it was fun us just kind of BSing back and forth on like, hey, is this going to work, and feeling out the process. So yeah, it was really fun. And I, came out of that one of the strongest I've ever been in my life. Like, I think if anything, I've gotten weaker over the summer versus the start of the summer where I was prepped for that competition. So yeah, it was a pleasure, man. And lots of fun.
yeah. That competition that Troy puts on is a fantastic competition. It's a great idea. It's what he's doing is paying homage to the original strongman idea is what it is. That's what strongman was all about. And like to do a log clean and press with no handles, that's just a tremendous event. And
Brutal.
That was.
yeah,
And
you know,
outside too, right? Because that's so
yeah.
much different. If anyone hasn't pressed outside, it is absolutely 100% different than pressing under a ceiling, which sounds dumb until you do it, but it is a drastic difference.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that, that experience was, we learned together as we went along,
Sure.
because, you don't have all the answers and you need to stay open-minded. And sometimes things look great on paper or an idea you think is just brilliant. And then you try it and it's not practical whatsoever. It just doesn't work.
Sure.
And I think that especially with new events like that, if you've never done them, I've never done a log clean and press with no handles. And so you, of course, would think that it's going to be similar to a regular log with handles, but it's a different animal. And so it was a lot of fun to experiment and figure out what, to really dial things in and figure out what works and what doesn't. And it's the scientific method, but with a real person doing a real thing in real life. It's great.
Yeah, we got to see some people do that kind of experimentation with their approach to doing the log and a couple of the other events at the event, which is also kind of fun to see too. Some of the oddball
Oh
ways
yeah,
people to
yeah,
approach lifting a log with no handles and doing a 100-pound stone throw and things like that. It was good.
One guy he even said, "Well, I'm going to do it 6 to 8 times." He was pretty sure on himself, and I think he got one.
Yeah.
there
Well,
was
Yeah.
one time at the I love this story because it's self-deprecating humor. Um, so I was notoriously bad at overhead pressing in general. I seem to be, for whatever reason, very good with the circus dumbbell, but with the log and axle, I was okay, but I was always lagging behind, especially with against my competition in the 90 kilogram class. And so at the Worlds one year, at OSG, they had a medley and they had a keg, a circus dumbbell, an axle, and a log. And I knew because of the weights, I wasn't going to have a chance at the axle or the log, but I would have a chance at the circus dumbbell and the keg. And the keg was 240.
Boy, that's
And yeah, and so with a keg overhead press, it's almost really just the clean. If you can clean it, you're going to be able to press it. And I was really struggling with it. And so my coach, Mike Mistel, came up with this idea. It was not mine. And we came up with an alternative technique, which is completely ridiculous. And I'll tell you what it was. So you would start with the keg standing upright in front of you, and you would bear hug it just like you're doing a Husafell pick.
Yeah.
And you would lap it, and you would put your legs together to create a shelf, and you would then shoulder the keg from that position. Okay, so you would have it on one shoulder, and you would then let go with one hand, just like you would to shoulder the keg. But then you would work the keg to the back of your neck, okay, across your shoulder. Okay. So you have to shimmy it into place. You then have to find a hand position and the handle. And the way that it would work is that the hand that was in the handhold, you couldn't put your thumb in the handhold because you would just break your thumb. So you had to press it thumbless. Or sorry, not the handle side, the non-handle side, because there is no place for the thumb.
Yeah.
And so it was completely ridiculous. I was doing keg cleans with 240 pounds that would take 30 seconds to get into position before you could press them. And I ended up, again, completely ridiculous. When I was warming up down there, you should have seen the looks that I was getting by the fellow competitors, because nobody had ever seen anybody attempt to clean a keg like that, because you never would unless you absolutely had to, because that was the only way that you'd be able to press the thing. Yeah. And so they were using the Mike Bartos Power Center kegs, which are loadable, plate loadable, and all of the weight, they use just regular weight plates. They're all centered in the keg. So it's unlike a traditional keg, which is what I have at the gym, where you have weight through, like equally balanced throughout the implement. And so what happened is when I tried to clean the keg, it was only heavy in the middle, and I completely just threw it over my shoulder and ended up not being able to press it. So it was a terrible event for me, but I did press my 240-pound keg numerous times in the gym using that ridiculous technique, and it just reminds me of it because it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that is funny.
Oh man, well, yeah. To Keith, what's coming up next? When's the next stone tour? Where are you going to?
Yeah, I think that. So I think I will probably go to Ireland next. Yeah. I'm getting old, and the stones there are very, very heavy, and I think that the longer I wait to go there, the more difficult they will be. I found a huge difference in my recovery from Sweden versus only a year prior to that, 11 months prior to that, my trip to Scotland. So the clock is ticking. I feel like I have to get those stones done if I'm going to be able to get them done. So I'd like to go to Ireland next, and I think that I would like to go back to Iceland as well, probably after, because there are a lot of newly rediscovered stones since I was there in 2019. I kind of just missed them, and there are certainly enough stones to make a second trip, and the stones there are extremely heavy as well. So I think probably in that order. The thing about Sweden is Sweden has so many stones that I think a guy could go back there numerous times if he wanted to. Unfortunately, I've lifted just about all of the stones in Scotland. And so I probably am not going to go back, other than maybe for pleasure, because the country is beautiful. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. Who knows what's going to happen, of course, but I would say that is my plan. And I think that there are enough stones. If David keeps doing what he's doing, there might be enough stones for a second trip to Ireland in a year's time.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about that for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Keith. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Absolutely, Keith. See you, man.
Thank you.
All right, we'll cut it there.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was great.